Welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm Emily Jashinsky, culture editor here at The Federalist. As always, you can shoot an email to the show at radio@thefederalist.com. I am here today with my colleague, John Daniel Davidson, politics editor at The Federalist. John, thanks so much for stopping by on election week.
Yeah, thanks for chatting with me.
Yeah, of course. I mean, everyone right now is obviously, understandably obsessed with the presidential race. But the Senate, the direction of the Senate, the leadership of the Senate hangs in the balance. Republicans have a slim majority in the Senate right now. We've seen the kind of problems that can cause and the sort of victories that can gain for conservatives already over the course of the last couple of years. I mean, they just barely confirmed a replacement for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Donald Trump, somewhat improbably, has actually nominated 3 Supreme Court justices now. So I think, the Senate has been, the last few years have been an exhibition in exactly how important it is for either party to maintain control of the Senate. Democrats have had so many disappointments in the Senate recently. So it's actually really important and certainly constitutionally as important for us to be talking about the Senate as it is the presidency. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I totally agree with that. And as you said, the margin is narrow. But of course, the Republican margin majority increased slightly in 2018, which of course was, a lot of people didn't talk about that in the Amy Coney Barrett fracas because, the American people expanded the Senate majority, the Republican Senate majority in 2018. So that was the mandate from the people that Democrats were crying foul about. But yeah, the Senate is an important an important part of the government as we've seen as you ran down, and there's a bunch of contested races that are close, some too close to call. We're probably going to see some Senate seats switch hands from Republican to Democrat, and maybe the other direction. And I've seen some commentary in the last couple of days talking about the possibility of a Biden win, but Republicans retaining control of the Senate, which of course, again, to your point, would be a huge check on what a Biden administration would be able to do, and might absolutely temper some of the more radical, progressive, left-wing, woke impulses of a Democratic Party with a Biden administration in the White House. So yes, we should be paying attention to Senate races. And if you live in a state with a Senate race, you should be paying attention to it and know who the candidates are and what they stand for, and go out and vote. Of course, we won't tell you who to vote for, but it's important who controls the Senate. Suffice to say, and so I guess, Emily, let's just go through some of those races for our viewers who may not have been paying attention because they've been understandably focused on the presidential race. The most obvious one where we have a Republican who is in danger and whose chances are slim, I think, is in Arizona, where Republican Senator Martha McSally is facing a tough race from Mark Kelly, an astronaut, which, she's a former military pilot, but he's an astronaut. So, but she is probably going to lose, which means Arizona is probably going to have 2 Democratic senators in Kristen Sinema and Mark Kelly, which will be the first time that's happened in Arizona, I think, since the 1950s, which will be a big change for that state, especially as we're talking about Arizona being one of these battleground states this year that could go either way for Trump or Biden.
I think what's interesting, mentioning McSally, I think one thing that's interesting about this Senate map is that is a slate of pretty high-profile Republican senators that could be losing their seats. McSally being one of them, and McSally is someone who's been really hyped up by the Republican establishment because she does have this incredible background of being the first female fighter pilot. She's not somebody with an irresistible charisma. So there's sort of
No.
this like contradiction between McSally's sort of potential with her resume as a politician and then her ability to execute and to be a really likable. It's kind of I think it's actually kind of a sad story because I think Martha McSally is somebody who's really smart, has a strong moral compass and this really impressive background. She's just really never been able to make it as a politician because she doesn't have that irresistible personality. She's really like, I'm not even saying this in a sexist way, although it's going to sound it, but she's not super likable because I think she just comes across as sort of robotic and it's hard for her to connect with people.
Yeah, not a good candidate. She's not a good candidate. But then, people who become like fighter pilots,
Yeah.
are a not necessarily the kind of people you would imagine being really good at glad handing as a politician. Um, Super high achieving individuals and kind of straight laced type A personalities are the kind of people who tend to be fighter pilots and combat fighter pilots, and that's not that doesn't often make for a good retail politician. But yeah, I agree. It's unfair because the people who make for good retail politicians often don't make for very good senators. Um, but so Martha McSally is one in Arizona. The other kind of high profile one, if we just want to kind of hit the top lines here,
Mhm.
is Senator Cory Gardner in Colorado, who's facing a very tough race against former Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper, who I've always thought is a little bit weird, kind of a weirdo. But nevertheless, briefly, we saw him in the Democratic um, primary debates. He ran for the Democratic presidential nomination. He didn't get very far, but that was sort of his. I kind of feel like he did that just to set himself up to run against Gardner for the Senate in Colorado, and that is also a very will be a very tough reelection bid for Gardner, who has been trending behind in the polls against Hickenlooper. I think the last poll was something like 10 points, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yeah, he's been
Yeah.
trailing pretty badly. So that there's Cory Gardner, and he's another politician who the sort of party establishment has really wanted to succeed, and I think he has a future if he loses, which he's likely to. I think he has a future in Republican politics if he does lose. But another one that it's just really hard to see how she pulls it out is an institution in the Senate, and whether you like her or not. Susan Collins. It's hard to see how Susan Collins holds on to that seat in Maine that she has had for so many years.
Yeah, I don't think she's going to. And uh, she's the least Republican senator that we have, and her decision, she gave this speech, this widely circulated speech about why she was voting to confirm Justice Kavanaugh, and then she didn't vote for Barrett, which didn't win her any friends. But yeah, I don't see how she holds on to that seat, and I don't see how she has unlike Gardner, I don't see how she has really a future in the Republican Party. Cory Gardner is a good politician. Like we were saying, he's sort of has some charisma. He's likable. He's sort of well spoken, and he has embraced kind of some Trumpist attitudes and postures that people like Susan Collins have not and never will. And so I kind of just see Susan Collins losing and sort of disappearing from public life altogether after she loses.
Yeah, I agree with that. Although It's interesting to see how this would affect her reputation in Maine sort of long term, because she has historically been really popular in Maine. Mainers really like Susan Collins, and it's a very local, her story is a very local one, not so much a national one. And that's sort of why she's been able to hang on for so long, is because she plays locally to what her constituents in that state want. And it's worked really well for her. So it's interesting that she's sort of going to be a casualty of the Trump era. Two more people, I think that this is going to be tough for Tom Tillis. It's going to be tough for Joni Ernst. Now, of those two, I think Ernst is probably most comfortable going into Election Day. She sort of had a late in the game surge. But these are two pretty high profile Republican senators. These aren't names that you don't recognize. These are people who really have outward public visibility, and they're clinging for dear life to their seats.
Yeah, and we've seen some campaigning on the Trump campaign's behalf for Ernst in recent days. She's one of these Republican senators that has embraced sort of Trumpism and struck very Trumpist tones throughout her term. Well, I guess in the past 4 years. And yeah, it's a toss-up. I think it depends on what polls you pay attention to and what polls you weight and kind of value. I know some recent polling has shown Tillis and Ernst are going to be okay. But like a lot of things, I think it's a toss-up on those two. And again, there's not very many Republicans can't afford to lose very many seats. They have a very narrow majority, and it's possible that if Ernst and Tillis lose, and a handful of these others that we've talked about also lose, Democrats could eke out a 51 seat majority in the Senate, and it'll be because the stars aligned on all of these or on enough of these races that are too close to call. The Tillis and Ernst races being two of the main ones.
Do you think there are any places where Republicans stand to pick up seats tomorrow?
There is instead of just holding the line, I think the big one is Alabama, where Doug Jones won against Roy Moore in the special election in 2018, and he's trailing behind. Alabama is not a place that elects Republican senators, and just to review, I actually went to Alabama in December 2018 for this special election between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. Roy Moore, of course, the kind of weirdo who was accused of having relationships with like teenage girls years ago and stuff, and is just generally a strange guy. But I drove through Alabama interviewing like Baptist preachers who were all supporting Roy Moore and like didn't believe the accusations against him. And it was a really interesting reporting trip that took me to very rural areas of Alabama and ended in a snowstorm while I was driving to Atlanta. So very, very fun trip. But anyway, so Alabama, Doug Jones is the Democrat senator. He's running against Republican Tommy Tuberville, who's a former Auburn football coach and who bested Jeff Sessions for the Republican primary. Jeff Sessions, of course, is the one whose resignation brought the special election between Roy Moore and Doug Jones. So that's one where I think Republicans can pick up a seat that's probably their best chance of picking up a seat now held by Democrats.
Yeah, that seems like almost certain to go to Tuberville. And I think Doug Jones has known that since he won against Roy Moore.
Totally. Yeah. He lucked out that he ran against Roy Moore. That's pretty much the only way he was going to, any Democrat was going to win a Senate seat in Alabama. Another race that we should mention, that I want to mention because I live in Texas, and mainstream pundits like to talk about Texas every presidential election cycle as this is the time. Texas, may turn blue, the long-awaited turning blue of Texas. So Senator John Cornyn is running for re-election, and his Democratic challenger is MJ Hagar, a kind of woman who cusses a lot and has tried really hard to portray herself as just like a tough as nails Texas lady who's going to get Cornyn out of there and represent the new Texas. Polls are showing Cornyn consistently ahead by comfortable enough margins that I actually don't fully understand the argument for why they think Texas is in play. I think they think that Texas is in play in the presidential race, and that because some polls have showed, Biden and Trump within a margin of error in Texas, they think, well, if Texas votes for Biden, that means all the down ballot Democrats are in play too, and that's not really how Texas politics works. I can see a scenario where Biden would win in Texas narrowly. I don't think he will, but that down ballot races would still go to Republicans. Can also see the opposite, where Trump would win in Texas, but enough maybe state house seats flip in Texas that Democrats gain seats in the Texas House, or maybe even gain a majority. But I don't think Hagar has any chance against Cornyn. I don't think that Senate race is really in play, despite what you may see in the mainstream media. Now, I'll probably be proven completely wrong because I made a prediction, but
Right, that's always what happens.
You're not supposed to do.
Yes, no predictions. We will just traffic in wild conjecture, just baseless. No, so that actually brings up a couple of other races. When you're talking about some of these southern states, these red wall states that the media loves to hype up as potentially flipping and going Democrat, there are a couple examples that have been getting a lot of attention in the press. Those would be Purdue in Georgia and Lindsey Graham in South Carolina. Lindsey Graham's opponent has had the surge in fundraising and has attracted a lot of media attention. Do you think either of those seats will even be close, or do you think this has sort of been much ado about nothing in the media?
Here you're setting me up to make predictions again. I don't think Lindsey Graham is going to lose his seat. Despite the fundraising surge, I think fundraising when it comes to state, because going back to Texas, pundits have made a big deal about Hagar's fundraising as well. I think fundraising only goes so far in a statewide elections like Senate or whatever. And so I don't think that Graham will lose despite the fundraising. The other one you mentioned, Georgia. I think this is in Georgia, Purdue and this guy Ossoff who ran. Was it? Remind me again. He ran for governor in 2018 or something?
He ran actually
No,
for Tom Price's seat when Tom.
Yes, that's right. It was a congressional seat. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I don't think Ossoff is going to win, and it's a highly subjective reason because I think he's too much of like a pipsqueak and not likable enough, and I don't think he's going to win. That's not a very good reason. I know that that's supposed to be a tight race, and I know that again, Ossoff is supposed to have raised all this money, and he had his viral debate moment. To the extent anyone watches, these debates between statewide candidates, I just don't see him pulling off a win there in Georgia. There's also something ineffable about the stink of loss sticking to a candidate, because the only reason anyone recognizes Ossoff's name, and I had to think who he was as well, but the only reason I remember his name is because the media made such a big deal out of how he was going to win and how he was going to, inaugurate a blue wave, crashing into Georgia, and that he was the sort of first sign of Georgia turning blue, and then he lost. And I don't know. I think that plays in voters' minds as well, especially in voters in Georgia.
Yeah, there was an interesting conversation that's worth revisiting when Ossoff was first running about how he was kind of this candidate that could flip a long time. It was actually Newt Gingrich's district, a long time Republican stronghold into the Democrats' favor because he appealed to this new demographic of suburban voters that had steadily grown and grown over the decades. And so it just sort of raises this question. And, honestly, this brings me to Minnesota, where we had Tom Bevan on the podcast last week of Real Clear Politics. And Tom said, honestly, the race to watch is Minnesota. And it's kind of this question of, what's happening between the two parties when I think if Donald Trump is able to, I know that he's running behind, but if he's able to turn out people in rural northern Minnesota, he could potentially carry Jason Lewis to victory because there may be something that's not being picked up on in polls, just like there was last time around. And Jen, you actually were in Minnesota. You were actually reporting, you were on a reporting trip in Minnesota. What do you think about that race? Because it just sort of reminds me of what's happening for the Democrats in the suburbs and the Republicans in rural areas.
I don't think that, this trip that I went on with our colleague Christopher Bedford through Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. What we consistently found talking to people is that the polls didn't seem to be reflecting what people were saying, and we kept having these sort of counter-narrative conversations in places that you wouldn't expect to find Trump voters, or you wouldn't expect to find people who would admit to voting for Republicans. And that includes Minneapolis, where, which is a deep blue, and not just blue, it's a progressive city. It's one of the most progressive cities in the country. You rank it along with Portland, Oregon, and Seattle and San Francisco. But we found people there who would, describe themselves as being left wing, but nevertheless are planning to vote for Trump. In that kind of a scenario, and I think in Minnesota, this is more relevant than it is maybe in some place like Texas. But if you have a situation in Minnesota where Trump overperforms significantly, and you have increased turnout because people want to vote for Trump, then that could also trickle down to the Senate race and have an impact up and down the ballot. Just because Trump is going to, if he overperforms in a way that sort of shatters all the polling and proves once again that the polls were wildly overestimating Democratic support at the top of the ticket.
One thing I think that is impacting these Senate races, and I'm going to report a story out for this, the Federalist, that should be out tomorrow, is that there was a group that was doing focus groups with college-educated suburban voters for the last 22 weeks. So that is through coronavirus, through the race riots, all of that good stuff, through the election. And they found, and I think it's a Republican-affiliated group, but they found what they said was that these suburbs are still center right and are really put off when you can sort of tie Biden and the Democratic Party to radicalism. And, that might be more difficult to do with Joe Biden than Kamala Harris. But I'm curious, as you went through some of these Rust Belt states, you were in the suburbs of Milwaukee, where I'm from. If you think that's true, if you think some of these culture war issues are where Republicans can sort of keep those suburban voters, and Democrats will risk losing those suburban voters, because when Trump's gone, Democrats can't run on Trump anymore, right? Like they're gonna have to run on their own agenda. And I'm curious to see if you think that it's as unpalatable as it seems to those sorts of voters.
I mean, it is true that Trump is struggling with, college-educated suburban women all over the country, and including the suburbs of Milwaukee. We talked to one state senator in Waukegan who told us he had a great description for these people. he wasn't trying to be insulting, but it was just a great descriptor of suburban women who, are sort of Paul Ryan Republicans who are not going to vote for Trump. And he said that they like to think of themselves as well-read. uh, and this is sort of kind of the kind of Paul Ryan Republican, buttoned up, staid, traditional conservative, not culture warriors, who are just turned off by Trump. They think he's mean. They think he's gross. They're not going to vote for him. And this particular state senator was telling us that, that Trump being at the top of the ticket hurts his reelection chances, because it hurts him with these voters who are more inclined to vote for Joe Biden. And I think this is a group of voters that it's harder to pin radical leftism on someone like Joe Biden, because they don't see the connection maybe in the way that you and I, or people who follow this stuff more closely do. They just see Joe Biden as a familiar face. He's been around forever. And, if he says he's not a radical, he's not a radical. Of course, the reality is much different. Joe Biden is sort of a puppet for the left wing of the Democratic Party. And there's a lot of reasons to think so. But these voters, I think, are not going to see that as much. And so we were told more than once that the what they call the WOW counties around Milwaukee, the suburban counties that ring Milwaukee, that have traditionally been, the key to the electoral key to Wisconsin, and have traditionally voted Republican, are increasingly Democratic. They are more diverse, and the voters there are just less inclined to vote for a Trumpist Republican Party. So I think that's a real problem that the Republican Party has in Wisconsin. And the question is, can they offset the loss of those suburban votes with drawing out more working class people in more rural areas, and capturing more votes among Hispanics, or among the Black community, and increasing the Trump effect, 2016 Trump effect, drawing even more people out from those working class areas that traditionally voted Democratic. I
Yeah,
don't know.
I think it's going to be really interesting. One of the projects post tomorrow is going to be digging into the numbers in some of these Senate races and seeing whether they are able to offset maybe suburban losses and Democrats, increasing turnout in urban areas compared to 2016, when Hillary Clinton was unpopular and, people just didn't even want to vote, period, let alone for Hillary. I mean, I'm curious about that, and I'm curious to see, because I think this is something that's impacting the Senate races. What you sort of just like the microcosm that you just discussed in the WOW counties in Wisconsin, I have to imagine is impacting Senate races in Texas, and probably more so as the years go on, in North Carolina, in Arizona, in Georgia. So I think that's going to be the thing, is when we have some of these numbers in, seeing exactly how poorly Republicans did. But at the same time, there's this enduring question that we may or may not start getting answers to, which is, what does the landscape look like post-Trump? When Democrats can't against Trump, when he's not at the top of the ticket, is somebody like Tillis or Cornyn or McSally in a better position or a worse position? And it just seems like that's it's almost an impossible question to answer right now.
And one of the reasons it's impossible is because we don't know to what degree will the Republican Party continue and sort of lean into becoming a populist party that appeals to working class people, and that really embraces working class people, and Black voters and Hispanic voters and rural voters and voters without college educations. If they continue to do that, if the Republican Party can really become a right populist working class party, then it will help offset these losses in the suburbs. Because you're right, the suburbs of Dallas and Houston for sure, but the suburbs of Dallas and Houston are turning blue as well. And so the long-term question in a place like Texas, Trump, I feel pretty confident, is going to win Texas, and I feel confident Cornyn's going to win Texas too. But it doesn't change the long-term shift happening in Texas, is that the cities are turning blue and the suburbs are turning blue. And the only way the Republican Party in Texas is going to stop that is by bringing new voters into the coalition, bringing in Mexican American voters, bringing in Black voters, bringing in working class voters that may have once voted Democratic. To the extent the Republican Party embraces that after Trump, if we have an after Trump Republican Party after Tuesday, then yes, you will be able to be competitive in places that you might not otherwise be. But again, both parties are going through these massive shifts, and in a way, Republicans are ahead of Democrats. I was talking to a friend the other day who said, look, it doesn't matter if Joe Biden wins or not. The Democratic Party is in trouble because their coalition is breaking up, and it's not clear that when they're, as you say, if they're not running against Trump, do they have a majority party? How could they put one together? When you're losing voters among traditional Democratic coalition, groups, can you make them all up with college-educated suburban white women? Are there enough of those women? Are there enough Karens out there to make up for massive losses among Black voters, among Hispanic voters, among working class, blue-collar voters across the Midwest? And that's the question the Democratic Party doesn't have an answer for. And this election is not, even if they win, it's not going to help them figure that out.
Well, and what's worse is that, again, going back to Trump, there's nobody who's going to turn women off, no pun intended, like Donald Trump politically. It's just he's so singular, and women have had such a reaction to him. You can argue a lot of that is because of the media's treatment of Trump. But Republicans, whoever's in charge of the Republican Party after Trump is not going to be Trump. And so there's a serious question as to whether when we're looking at some of these polls that do show the Trump era Republican Party making inroads with Black men, Hispanic men. I mean, sure, there's a question of whether that's durable, but there's also a question of whether that actually totally offsets in the long term any losses among some of these suburban women. And, the other thing is the Democratic Party has been allowed to sort of sneakily become more and more radical on these cultural issues over the course of the Trump administration, because it's all been about Trump, 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 Trump. They can get away with doing it because there's so many voters in this country that just prioritize voting for and against Trump, even in down ballot races. So they've gotten away with, having a candidate like Joe Biden, who's a septuagenarian, who says things like, well, if an 8-year-old wants a gender reassignment and that's going to make them happy, we can't discriminate against them in any way. So they're left in the sort of wreckage of the Trump era with a party that has gotten significantly more radical on these cultural issues in ways that, frankly, might swing suburban women back to Republicans.
Yeah, if Trump's not around, if Trump's not at the top of the ticket, sure. Yeah, it might. And again, these are luxury items that Democrats have decided to make a part of their agenda. Transgender ideology, radical policies on abortion, to say nothing of more of the structural things like getting rid of the Electoral College and adding new states and crazy stuff like that. But those are not things that working class voters and people in traditionally sort of more marginalized voter groups care about. They are luxury items that wealthy white progressive people care about. And if the Democrats want to be the party of wealthy white progressive people, then they're welcome to it. They'll never win a national election again.
They can continue raking in that Wall Street cash like Joe Biden was doing the last election. John, you actually just created the perfect segue into what I wanted to close on, which is that the Senate is extremely important this time. And I mean, of course, it's always important. And that's the cliche about now more than ever and the most important election of our lifetime. But Joe Biden's platform is radical. If you look at sort of what he wants to do to this country, things that the Senate would need to rubber stamp to get to his desk, he wants to do them, and he wants to do them immediately. And these include things, the biggest one on my mind right now is the Equality Act, which would be disastrous for religious freedom, but is probably one of the easiest pieces of legislation for Democrats to pass if they have the Senate and the presidency and the House, because they'll probably even pick off some of these like super weak, like spineless Republicans, because it sounds like such a nice piece of legislation. Taylor Swift says if you don't support it, you're a bigot. And so there are all of these like bills, including the Equality Act, including whatever climate change legislation he is able to pass, whatever, he literally wants to pack courts. He won't say it, but he wants to do all of these things. And the Senate is going to be his best friend in that. And he wants to do them immediately. So if Democrats win the Senate, I think, the country's in for a rude awakening as to what the Democratic Party has actually become.
Yeah, and it's going to be a surprise when they start doing things that a Democratic Party under Harry Reid's leadership during the Obama presidency would never have tried to do. However, I'll just remind our listeners that it was when Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader that every Democratic senator voted to repeal the First Amendment under the guise of campaign finance law. So the kinds of things that were brewing in the Democratic Party during Obama's second term, this was in 2014 they did this, are going to come to fruition in a Democratic-controlled Senate with a Biden White House, should that happen. And we will see things like the Equality Act. We will see, the Biden's commission to study reforms of the Supreme Court, which we all know what that means. We'll also see, Biden has said many times that he would like to codify Roe versus Wade into federal law, which is a way of sort of taking it off the table from the Supreme Court and trying to preempt kind of state level regulations of abortions of the kind that we've seen increasingly from more Republican leaning states. But it would be a radical thing to do, and it would be perfectly in line with all of the other radical things that we've listed off that Democrats have said they would like to do. But I think it will be a rude awakening for people, because I think people have forgotten how the Democratic Party was changing in Obama's second. Democrats talking about when Harry Reid was the Senate Majority Leader. We've all forgotten about that because we've had 4 years of Trump and we've had all of this upheaval that we've been talking about. But the Democratic Party's been changing like this for a while, and whenever they do get back in power, it is going to be surprising to people what they try to do, and it's not going to be popular. And it may be a very short time they have in the majority if they get one.
Yeah, I think that's so true. I think they've gotten away with lurching further left steadily over the course of the Trump administration while everybody was sort of paying attention just to Trump. Where things stand right now, heading into Election Day, John and I are talking on Monday afternoon. There are 9 toss-up races, according to Real Clear Politics. Republicans are running in 7 of those. Republicans have 38 safe seats or seats not up for election. Democrats have 40 safe seats or seats not up for election. So with those 9 toss-up races, just about all of them which were addressed on this podcast, those are really going to be the ones to watch, of course. But I think even more importantly than that, we'll be digging into those numbers and seeing who voted for whom demographically in the days after we know the election results. And when I say days after we know the election results, I could mean months.
Yeah, I was going to say, you may mean weeks or months. Let's hope not. Let's hope not.
Fingers crossed for a speedy conclusion and a fair one, and one that we can all agree on, although it's 2020, so I'm not super optimistic about that. John Davidson, thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Thanks for having me. It was a pleasure talking.
All right. Well, we'll both try to get some rest tonight. It's going to be a long week and certainly a long Tuesday. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'm Emily Jashinsky. He's John Daniel Davidson. Until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.